Greetings to you. Today we're looking at the first half of Luke 23. That is Luke chapter 23, verses 1 to 25. Luke 23, 1 to 25. And this is the story of the rest of the trials of Jesus, the mock trials, the appalling display of judicial cruelty, irregularity, and so on. It began in the previous chapter when the assembly of the elders and chief priests and scribes had gathered together and brought him to the council. That was unsatisfactory, um, and they just sent him on because they wanted him put to death. And legally, the only person who could pass a death sentence was Pilate, the Roman governor. The Jews managed to pass death sentences in other ways at other times, the Jewish leaders, but they wanted this to be absolutely cut and dried and legal. And they wanted it to be a decision from Rome. And Pilate, as the Roman governor, had complete power even to sentence someone to a cruel death. So we're in chapter 23. The assembly, that is the Sanhedrin, the assembly of the Jewish leaders, both religious and we would today call secular, but that doesn't quite fit. The leaders of the people and the leaders of their religion. They rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate, unanimous or near unanimous. They began to accuse him, and here's the accusation, and this is interesting, verse 2. We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king. Now, that isn't three accusations, it's one. He is perverting our nation. And that's fascinating. It takes you back, if you wish, and the Jewish leaders would have been well aware of that, into Deuteronomy 13 and all that. The accusation is that Jesus is a false prophet leading the people astray and subverting the nation as we would say nowadays, a nation under God. That's a serious, serious accusation. And in the Old Testament, in the law of Moses, that would have been punishable by death. Simple as that. That is the accusation. That, of course, won't weigh for very much with Pilate, who is a Roman and not a Jew, and probably didn't know Deuteronomy and wasn't interested in the Jewish law. He had to keep the peace within Judea, but he wasn't too bothered about the details of the Jewish law at all. So they elaborate. Their one accusation, as far as they're concerned, is that he is perverting the nation, leading it away from God. Worse than disturbing the peace. And their exposition of that comes in two parts, which might appeal a bit more to Pilate or get him worried. We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor. Now that would interest Pilate, if he thought it was true. And saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king. Now, Messiah is the one they hate, but they can interpret Messiah as king, and that's reasonable enough. Messiah means the anointed one, and in the Old Testament it was the kings who were anointed. And Jesus as the anointed one of God, which he is happy to accept as a title, actually is a statement of his kingship. But a statement that he is king might be seen as a challenge to Rome. So they're presenting his perverting the nation as being a twofold challenge to Rome to make the case stick with Pilate. But it's one charge, it's their charge that he is perverting the nation, undermining the nation, suborning, turning it away from God. And in their understanding, that makes him a false prophet, Deuteronomy, and worthy of death. But they're trying to make him worthy of death in Pilate's terms, which would be don't pay taxes to the emperor and declare himself to be the king. So Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" This is presumably a very abbreviated account of what went on. And Jesus answers, "You say so." Or as we saw last time, we could translate, "You've said it. You've said it." He is the king of the Jews, and he's not going to deny it. But he's actually saying, I haven't actually said those words. You've said those words. You've said it. You said so. And then Pilate, this is strange. We don't understand fully. Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, who are the crowds, by the way? It must be the Sanhedrin. There's no other people have been brought in at this point. So it's the assembly of the elders of the people, chief priests and scribes. Pilate says to them all, I find no basis for an accusation against this man. They were insistent. He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place. That's a bit of a mistake because they brought Galilee in, and Galilee has a sub-ruler, the wretched Herod. So Pilate can immediately send it all off to Herod for his judgment on the matter. Why does Pilate find no basis for an accusation? He's not interested in Jesus' religious misdemeanors, if they are that. He's no interest in whether Jesus is a true prophet or a false prophet. He's trying to find out whether Jesus is stirring up rebellion against Rome. That would be the crime for which he would sentence him to death. But he finds no basis for that. Uh, Jesus wasn't stirring up rebellion against Rome, and it only takes a cursory look at his teaching to find that out. Whether Pilate has asked other people, whether Pilate's already au fait with what Jesus is teaching through his wife or through others, I don't know. But he's being reasonable at this point. There's no ground for accusation. There's no proof of what you're saying. And when they're silly enough to say he started in Galilee, well, of course, is he a Galilean, says Pilate? Hopefully I can get rid of him. When he learned he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. Now, Herod's get a bit confusing in the New Testament. This isn't the Herod who murdered the babies at the time of Jesus' birth. That was the man nowadays called Herod the Great, who had done a huge amount in building and architecture and so on, who was under the Roman governor, the ruler of the whole area of Judea and wider afield, Greater Israel, the whole area of the Middle East, abutting the Mediterranean. Herod, when he died, his kingdom split apart and was subdivided among his sons. And Herod, this Herod, became tetrarch. It means one of four rulers. In other words, the kingdom was split into four. And Herod rules. Galilee and a bit more, but he's known as the Tetrarch of Galilee. So he's not as all powerful as his father had been, but he still has considerable power under Rome over Galilee and a slightly wider area, basically the north, but not the north east, not into Syria, but a lot of the north, even both sides of the Jordan. And this Herod, we discover, is very glad to see Jesus because he's been wanting to see him for a long time. He'd heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. I wonder if you remember earlier on in Luke's Gospel, Jesus had poured scorn on those who just want to see signs, just want to see miracles. The magic show is all they're interested in. Jesus wasn't terribly interested in their approach, and certainly didn't see that as the same as faith. But Herod wanted to see him perform a sign. He questioned him at some length, verse 9, but Jesus gave him no answer. That's very unusual. When Pilate asks him a question, he will give an answer. When the chief priests ask him a question, he will give an answer. Not quite the one they want, and usually quite subtle. When Herod asks, he just keeps quiet. Earlier on, he's described Herod as that fox. This Herod is the one who in Luke 13 had cruelly executed some Galileans, as it said, mixing their blood with their sacrifices. Herod was a bit of a monster and not respected. And Jesus doesn't disrespect him very conspicuously, but he doesn't answer him. He just isn't going to give an answer to this man. The chief priests and the scribes stood by. Somehow they've moved along as he's been sent from Pilate to Herod. The chief priests have stuck with it, and they're going to make their case to Herod as well. I mean, they would despise Herod because he is, in Second World War language, a quisling of the Roman Empire. A bit more than a puppet ruler because they give him some authority, but he wants to do what keeps Rome happy and keeps him in power under Rome, rather than always doing the best for his own people. They vehemently accuse Jesus in front of Herod, and even Herod, verse 11, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. They put an elegant robe on him, sent him back to Pilate. Herod isn't interested in hearing the case properly. He wants to see Jesus perform a miracle. That's it. And the awful, cynical picture of Herod that we see, for example, in the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, walk across my swimming pool in mockery, is a fairly good picture of what this Herod is like. He's no interest in justice. In fact, he sends him back to Pilate. He doesn't say, I agree with Pilate, you've done nothing wrong, you can go free. His only reason for sending him back to Pilate is so that Pilate could sentence him to the sentence that only Pilate can legitimately pass, which is death. We're told, verse 12, oddly, but Luke wants us to hear this. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Now, we might have a slightly warm feeling if we haven't got the whole picture and say, oh, that's a good thing. Somehow Jesus' presence healed an enmity between these two and made them pals, and the country was better off for it. That's not what he means. They became friends together. They'd been at each other's throats and hating each other and undermining each other until this point when they come together in agreement. And what is that agreement? Well, Luke makes it clear to us in his second volume in Acts. Uh, Let me read. Uh, Very difficult stuff. Part of Acts chapter 4. This is Peter and John speaking after they'd been arrested and told to stop preaching about Jesus. And they then go back to their friends and they report what's been done. And then they pray. And this is part of their prayer. Verses, they're quoting um, from the psalm, the kings of the earth took their stand, and the rulers have gathered together against the Lord and his Messiah. Uh, Psalm 2. For in this city, this is Acts 4:27, in this city, in fact, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you appointed. Herod and Pilate's unity, their common purpose, their friendship, was that together they would oppose Jesus. That's the sort of friendship that arose on this day. Herod was too much of a coward to say, I find him guilty, because he couldn't quite prove that, neither could Pilate. But he didn't want to let him off either, so he sent him back to Pilate for judgment. And Herod and Pilate did become friends in the sense that they worked together from then on against Jesus. You could say slightly reluctantly, you could say trying to cover their own backs, which I think is more the case, but they're united together. The first stage of that is Herod sending Jesus back to Pilate because he isn't going to let him go. Verse 13, Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, you brought me this man. This is a wider group. It's the Sanhedrin plus the people. What in America they sometimes call a town meeting. Anyone who'll listen. You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. Pilate understands the charge, which is perverting the people. It's being a false prophet in Jewish terms. And here I've examined him in your presence and not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he's done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him. He isn't saying he's completely innocent, or he wouldn't have him flogged at all, but nothing to deserve death. In other words, he's a bit of a rabble rouser, and he's a bit of trouble, and he's a nuisance. It's a really pain in the neck, but he's not worthy of death. And then reason flies out of the window. Verse 18, they all shouted out together, and this is the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, the leadership, the bigwigs of Jerusalem. They shouted out together, away with this fellow, release Barabbas for us. This was a man who'd been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate wanting to release Jesus, we hear elsewhere that his wife's had a dream and told him to release Jesus and not have his innocent blood on his hands. Pilate wanting to release Jesus addressed them again, trying to get some reason out of it, do it sort of the Roman way, which may involve cruelty, but they listened first. Wanting to release Jesus, he addressed them again, verse 20, but they kept shouting, Crucify, crucify him. It's not a merciful, speedy death. It's the worst death. It's the death of a common criminal. It's a cruel death. That Rome was able to do a merciful, quick, speedy death, or a cruel death, or various things in between. They were experts in killing. A third time Pilate said to them, verse 22, why, what evil has he done? Evil is the requirement for crucifixion. What evil has he done? I found in him no ground for the sentence of death. Again, I will therefore have him flogged and then release him. Yeah, he's a pain in the neck. He's maybe a bit of a disturber of the peace. He worries you, he worries me, but he isn't evil. He doesn't deserve death. So I'll flog him. That's not a minor thing. It's a horrible thing. And the evidence of the scale of flogging and what it meant is there in the history books. It's also there in what are now subterranean passageways and chambers under the old city of Jerusalem, where these punishments happened. And you can go there, at least you can, when Jerusalem's a safe place to visit, and find the place where all this happened and the great pillars to which people were tied when they were being flogged and so on. Not a minor punishment. Verse 23, but they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. Reason gone out the window. It's just sheer elemental animal hatred. Comes from a religious thinking and background, and there's a horrible truth in that today. We see some dreadful things done in the name of religion that religion doesn't necessarily justify or call for, but people can get so caught up in their religion and their insistence on getting their religion right and all other religions being wrong. They can get so caught up in that they lose the sense of human decency and humanity. And and that's happened right through history, and it's happened sometimes in church history. And as Christians, if we know anything at all about the Crusades and so on, we should be mightily ashamed of that. If we know anything about the burnings and the other forms of execution against Christians who disagreed on doctrine in the 16th century, we should be mighty ashamed of that, and so on. Christianity doesn't have a clean copybook in relation to all this, but neither does, as we see here, Judaism or Islam or any of the great religions. Whatever you think about whether the teaching is predominantly good or innocent or pure, certainly, and that's arguable at times with religions. We have to be very careful. But certainly here, the leaders lose any pretense at rationality and say, we want him dead, and we want him dead cruelly, and we want him treated as the worst of the worst. Urgently demanding with loud voices that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. Pilate is ground down, worn down. Now, Pilate had the absolute authority to tell them to get lost. He had the soldiers to enforce that. He could have said, you're not doing this. But he gives in, takes the easy course, perhaps. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. Verse 25, he released the man they asked for, the one who'd been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. That sounds as if he hands them back to the Jews to be crucified, for them to kill him. It doesn't quite mean that. He metaphorically hands him over to the Jews. He keeps him, in fact, in Roman custody, and it's Roman soldiers who, as we'll see next time, are going to do the actual deed of the crucifixion, that terrible thing, at Pilate's order. It isn't that Pilate has said, oh, washed his hands. Well, he did, but that's not the point. He's not washed his hands and said, well, Jews, you kill him if you want. I'm not going to stop you. He doesn't do that. He says, "Oh, you've worn me down with your shouting and your shouting. All right, I'll do what you want. I'll give him over to you in the sense I'll do what you want, and I will use my authority and my soldiers to kill him." Which is why Luke in Acts 4, which I've already quoted, and elsewhere in Acts, makes the point that it was uh, Roman Pilate as much as Herod and as much as the Jewish leaders. It was all of them together in this killing of Jesus. You can't lay the killing of Jesus at the feet of just one. Can't say it was just Jewish leaders. You can't say it was just Herod, the quisling king under Rome, puppet king. Uh, you can't say it was just Pilate or the Roman Empire. There's a whole lot of them. His own people and the rulers of the world and the rulers of Galilee, where he came from. They're all in it together. The rulers of this world have combined together against God's anointed, God's Messiah, Jesus the King. What can we say? Cruelty hasn't gone away from this world. Irrational wickedness hasn't departed from religion. And yet Jesus remains innocent. He's not the only innocent man to have been put to a horrible death in the name of religion at all. We're more than well aware of that in our own generation. He hasn't perverted their nation in the sense of turning them away from God. He's tried to turn them back to God. It's not it's not that religion is the problem, because Jesus is actually bringing religion to them in his own way and his own reading and understanding. He's not saying be secular, forget about this God stuff and worship here and worship there. Just cancel all that. Come out of religion because it's the problem. Jesus is teaching that religion is necessary. It's getting right with God and approaching God and relationship with God. Religion is all that, but religion gets perverted, and it's the Jewish religious leaders who've perverted, they've carried on the perversion of their fathers, but they have perverted Israel, not Jesus. They have turned Israel from a nation under God, seeking to relate to God and know Him and love Him, to a nation where they're just trying to protect their own interests and keep things the same and not listen to a voice challenging the way they do things, and certainly not listen to any authority outside their own sense of priesthood and leadership. And so, cruelly and wickedly, through a series of show trials, Jesus is condemned to death. Amen.